Hello and welcome to our Syxsense March Patch Tuesday webinar. Today, we have our industry expert, Rob Brown, here to give us an inside look into the newest Patch Tuesday releases.
Thank you very much, Johanna, and a very warm welcome to everyone today for the March Patch Tuesday webcast. Thank you also for everyone that's actually joining us an hour earlier than our usual broadcast window. In the UK and in Europe, we're actually an hour before an hour earlier because of daylight saving. So I do appreciate everyone taking the time today. We're going to talk about Microsoft Patch Tuesday, and from a patching perspective, we do actually have quite a bit to talk about. There's a few very serious vulnerabilities, and I'm going to show you how we prioritize patching in any environment based on experience of deploying over 100 million patches over the last decade. But to start with, we're going to talk about some news. And I thought this was quite an interesting set of news articles that I was reading this past month. Because speaking to a lot of customers about their Windows 10 feature update experience leading up to Windows 11, a lot of our customers had concerns around the actual design of Windows 11, the way that it looks. It's such a different operating system in terms of its appearance. So I just want to start off by saying that Windows 10 does have a life until October 14, 2025, and that does initially sound like quite a long way away, but really can creep up very, very quickly, especially when your environment is very large and distributed across the globe. That said, one of the reasons why big companies do not go to Windows 11 is because of the interface, the fact it's so much different than Windows 10 and every operating system before, that the users need extra training to understand where things are. One of the things that we've been told puts a lot of companies off is the toolbar. The fact that toolbar is now more centralized, although it can be moved to the side. The icons that are on the toolbar also look significantly different. That's very similar to the Apple OS. The fact that the icons can't be split from each other. You have to have one icon for each app. And when you hover over the app, you actually have the ability to see all of the different applications open. And you have to highlight which one of the programs to run by clicking them with the mouse. Now, Microsoft has said that the toolbar wasn't just an update of the old toolbar, it was a complete redevelopment. And so to simplify it is actually taking quite a lot of time. So really pleased that potentially as early as next month, we may actually be seeing some updates coming from Microsoft that were in this month's preview patches. Those preview patches are updates that are not typically used in mainstream. They're not supported by Microsoft, and if you do experience issues, you have to uninstall them. But they're offering a simplification of the Windows toolbar. So potentially being able to split your apps if you have the same application or document open, being able to split it, and also being able to put the name of the application. A lot of users from Windows 10 and before sort of like the name of their document as the icon. And since Windows 11, you just see a Word icon or an Excel icon. You don't actually know which file that you've opened. So that simplification may become as early as next month, which may incentivize a lot of our customers and those of you still on Windows 10 to move to Windows 11, so you can stay in a more mainstream support for another 10 odd years. We did have last week a out of band update for a CPU flaw. Now this is out of band, very serious. It's a security update where you have something called memory mapped IO stale data, MMIO. Basically, you can read it. So you can actually, it's an information disclosure vulnerability in which data that's being processed by the CPU could potentially be read, and therefore you have access to whatever the CPU was processing at the time. These fixes exist for Windows 10 through to Windows 11 and Server 2022. And if you haven't already deployed that, I highly recommend these KBs be included in this month's patch deployment. We also had some Adobe updates. Caesar highly encourage all customers to deploy these. Interestingly enough, there isn't an Adobe Reader update, and we, for the first time this year, have seen one of the Adobe vulnerabilities actually being weaponized. That's the Cold Fusion, known as APSB 23-25. Adobe has given that a priority 1. So if you do have Cold Fusion in your environment, Adobe is recommending that you deploy that within 3 days. So within 3 days, that deployment should have been performed to secure that product. Mozilla also released an out-of-band update at the beginning of this month. That was for 1.10.0.1. And they have since released another Mozilla Firefox browser that will include that weaponized threat earlier on this week, which is Firefox version 1.1.1. And they also released Firefox ESR 102.9. Each of the vulnerabilities that I mentioned, basically an attacker could exploit these to take control of an affected system. And a lot of customers, or a lot of customers that came to Syxsense, were actually relying on the self-updating module of Mozilla Firefox, and Google Chrome similar. But sometimes if the user has disabled that, you won't actually be able to self-update the browser. This is done in a lot of environments for change control. However, if you're not using Syxsense, please consider checking the registry keys of those systems to ensure that these browsers do have a self-update, because a weaponization like this can exploit your device, and it's important that you continue to deploy those patches even if you're in an environment where change control has to take place. It's extremely important that the third-party software updates are in your patching strategy, not just the operating systems themselves. So let's fast forward to Patch Tuesday. Now, yesterday, we had 73 fixes, which consisted of 6 critical, 66 important, and 1 moderate, which is really interesting because we're going to get to that moderate one in a second. But as I went through the list and I was classifying them, prioritizing them for this webinar, I noticed that there were 9 fixes for drivers. Now, there are 2 types of driver. This was actually really interesting to do this research because I was thinking about what kind of customer, what type of company could potentially impact where this vulnerability, if it was exploited. Now, there are 9 fixes for PostScript and PCL6 class printer drivers. Now, I just in my research, I was working out what the exact definition of a PostScript and a PCL6 class driver was. Now, a PostScript is typically desktop printers. So you have a printer on your desk. This is where you physically connect your device to that device, your laptop or your desktop to the device, and it actually sends the entire document to the printer, and it's stored in memory. This does make that a bit slower, and obviously those printers need some memory in order to process the document. A PCL6 is more network-based, and PCL actually stands for Printer Command Language, where the device sends the printer instructions 1 line at a time. This makes it much, much faster, and it's better across network infrastructure where you do have a local LAN involved. Now, we've seen just over a year ago the print nightmare, where changes to the printer design changed and caused an awful lot of printer issues, localized to specific types of printer. But in this case, this is a generic printer driver that can actually impact any of the printer hardware. And if you're in a healthcare or education or even potentially in retail, I can imagine that you'll be doing a lot of printing. So please make sure that you do test the printer driver update before you roll that to your mainstream devices, specifically if you have desktop printers, that's just like just a printer on the desk, or network-based. This also could impact any kind of printing to PDF. So if you have software that actually prints to a PDF file, then please test that as well. You certainly want to know if there's going to be an issue before you do that, before you do a wider rollout. Now, of the 73 fixes, 6 are more likely to be weaponized. This is directly from Microsoft. And in fact, one of the more likely to be weaponized is in fact weaponized. So that makes it even more serious. And of the other vulnerabilities that are less likely to be weaponized, one of them was actually weaponized as well. So 2 weaponized vulnerabilities in total in this release. One is publicly aware. Guess what? One of the weaponized vulnerabilities is that public aware vulnerability. So you have a double whammy. Certainly important that you deploy that. We also have 7 jump points. This is quite new to this webinar series, where we talk about jump points as being able to break out of a particular technology on the operating system and into another. The equivalent of a jump point is like saying that a vulnerability in the Google browser would allow you to jump into Windows. A vulnerability in VMware host allows you to jump into the guest and back. Now, this type of vulnerability allows you to go in through one particular exploit point, move inside Windows, and once you're in, you're able to do anything you like. This is exactly what happened as we've seen previously with the SolarWinds. They came in through one particular vulnerability, moved sideways, and then they were able to do whatever they wanted inside the network. There are 7 vulnerabilities fixed which have a jump point. In the CVSS, we call this a scope. So where the scope is changed, those are what we call jump points. It's very, very serious vulnerability to fix, and they don't always have a critical severity, which actually is quite interesting as well. Now, of all of the fixes, this is quite interesting set of data as well, because for the 3rd time this year, we have the most fixes, which are remote code execution vulnerability. That's a class of cyber attack in which attackers remotely execute commands to place malware or other malicious code on your computer or network. We had 25 of those. We had 17 elevation of privilege vulnerabilities. That's where a threat actor gains access to an employee's account, bypasses the proper authorization channel, and successfully grants themselves access to data they're not supposed to have. We have 14 information disclosure vulnerabilities. That's when a program unintentionally reveals sensitive information. For example, a password or a username, or even something like an IP address. That could be very useful when planning an active exploit. We have 10 spoofing vulnerabilities. That's one of our priorities today. That's the act of disguising a communication or identity, making one user look like another or one device look like another. We have 4 denial of service vulnerabilities, which are meant to shut down a computer or device, potentially like a denial of service attack, where you continually ping a device to disable it. And lastly, we have a security feature bypass vulnerability. We have 3 of those. That's when an attacker bypasses the authentication mechanisms to gain access to unauthorized devices. So certainly remote code execution is the 3rd highest, but we haven't seen as many of these bug fixes as we had seen last month. So I'm very happy to see that there are less remote code execution vulnerabilities in this release. They're the sort of, in my opinion, the sort of more serious of all of these. So how to prioritize? So Microsoft gives you a criticality, and you've built maybe your patching strategy around the Microsoft severity system. Potentially, if you're a Syxsense customer, we may have shown you what we call a 6 score. If you're not a Syxsense customer, that's okay. I'll just go through how we're going to prioritize patching today on the webcast. We firstly take the vendor severity. Now they're the source of truth from a patch perspective. It's their software, it's their patch. They can designate the severity however they wish. So we like to use the vendor severity, which goes from critical, high, medium, low, and NA, critical being the worst. But we also like to balance that against the independently assigned CVSS score. Now, the CVSS score is built from a calculator that determines the exact danger or exposure of that particular vulnerability, and that calculation is out of 10. So that vulnerability will give a 10 for the worst, and it will go all the way down to 0 when that actually means it doesn't have that much of a severity at all. But if you combine the two together, you get a balance. You get an independent assessment of the CVSS score, or you can say anything that's critical or high on either of these two should be selected for urgent deployment. Next, we have the state of the vulnerability. We call this weaponized. This means it's actively exploited. Obviously, anything that's actively exploited should be prioritized, even if the vendor severity and the CVSS score are not very high. Public aware, on the other hand, doesn't necessarily mean it's been weaponized, but it means the exact steps to exploit is on the internet. If we look back to Log4j, that was actually a YouTube video of somebody in Minecraft. And they explained that if they changed a piece of the code on the server, they were able to effectively exploit the vulnerability in a Minecraft game. It's a great way of showing how the minds of ethical hackers work when they're trying to find vulnerabilities in software. Now, public aware doesn't mean that it's going to be weaponized. Public aware means that the exact steps are available, but those exact steps may be incredibly difficult to follow. It may have multiple ring-fenced areas that have to have a very specific scenario in order to exploit. Nonetheless, I wouldn't want to be an IT manager that knew something was publicly aware and didn't react to that information to make a decision whether or not I wanted to deploy it. So you may decide in your patching strategy to use weaponized and public aware as part of your selection process. Now, to balance these, we have countermeasures. Countermeasures are available for some of the patches in this Patch Tuesday. They are either mitigations or workarounds. A mitigation is something like a highly sophisticated antivirus. That means you don't have to deploy the patch necessarily as quickly as you would need to. So there could be firewalls, or there could be antiviruses, malware protections in your environment that mean you don't have to be as quick or deploy as urgently. You want to do your testing to ensure that you're not going to experience issues with end user disruption. The other hand, you've got a workaround. So maybe we can deploy a registry key or change a service status that can effectively mitigate the issue that way. The workarounds can be deployed. We have inside Syxsense workarounds if they are available from the vendor to enable you a gap or a bridging of the gap between detection of the vulnerability and deployment of the patch. Of course, if you have any workarounds applied, please check the vendor's website to see if you should undo those workarounds following deployment, because you don't want to leave registry keys on your system if they're not actually being used. That is a vulnerability in itself. Lastly, your exposure. You put all of these together, and the highest exposed vulnerabilities that are severe in nature, weaponized and or public aware with no countermeasures should be your priority for deployment that month. And of course, as you roll that to your environment, you can choose to deploy based on bands of severity. So you get the worst ones out first, then you can work the second ones and the third ones out in an order that doesn't overuse your network and doesn't cause too much disruption to your users with all of the reboots that may or may not be required. So that's how we're going to prioritize our patching content that we are going to see on our website. So if you're familiar with this format, we actually do publish all of our details up to syxsense.com. I'll just bring that across. So on the syxsense.com website, we've got the navigation bar along the top. Here you can find our resources page where you can access our center. We also have news and a vulnerability database should you be interested. You can search that vulnerability database for resolutions to operating system configuration vulnerabilities, such as help and assistance with PowerShell to enable, disable BitLocker and other things like that. On the left-hand side, we have all of our topics. So this is actually quite cool. It's a new feature of Syxsense called Zero Trust. If you have any questions, please use the chat feature. You can ask us anything such as patching strategy, patch testing guides, things like that. Give us a little chat down there and we'll send something to you. And of course, if you would like to try Syxsense as a product to see if it's something that you would like to use instead of your existing patching tool, of course, you can schedule a demo to see that. So under the resources page, we have the Patch Tuesday links. I've just got these saved up here. It just makes it a lot easier for me to navigate through the site. So as I mentioned before, we've got 73 fixes, with 6 of those being critical, 2 of those being weaponized, and we have the fixes for Microsoft Windows, pretty much every single operating system for Microsoft Windows, Windows components, for Office and Office components, Edge, which is the Chromium browser only, Microsoft Dynamics, Visual Studio, and Azure all have updates this month. As I mentioned, we do have quite a lot of PostScript printer driver updates. Please make sure that you're testing every single type of printer that you have in your network to make sure you don't fall into the print nightmare that we had this time last year. We have 5 updates which resolve vulnerabilities that have a CVSS score more than 9. And actually, until last month, we hadn't seen anything of 9 or above from middle of last year. So although the vulnerabilities are increasing, the number of fixes released is actually decreasing. That's very good from a deployment perspective. It does look like since COVID, everything is now getting more into a testing and fully trusted patch cadence. Of course, anything that is added into Syxsense as a product will actually go through an additional test in our lab. I combined all of the CVSS scores up together because I'm interested to see if this month has a spike in the more serious vulnerability. And I'm actually really pleased to say that this month, the combined CVSS scores for all fixes is down to 529.6. Last month, it was 565.9. So that drop tells me that although the same number of vulnerabilities almost were released, they're lower in severity. And that's based on the independent CVSS score, not necessarily the vendor. So I'm actually pleased to say that there's a lot less serious things to worry about this month, but that doesn't mean you're off the hook. You still have to deploy these. If you're going to deploy any updates, these are my 3 picks. First one, CVE 2023-24880. It's a Windows Smart Screen security feature bypass vulnerability. You'll know what security feature bypass is because we just talked about it, and you should know about this because everything you download from the internet has an identifier called mark of the web. So on every single file, on every single hard drive that is NTFS based, everything you download from the internet will be tagged with this mark of the web zone identifier. Now, when you run those files, like say an executable file or a program or even a file, an Excel document, Windows will actually use what we call a Windows Smart Screen, and it would check the zone identifier of the file to see if it is trusted or not. If it is not trusted, it asks you, it says, hey, this has come from an untrusted source. Is it okay? That message is a prompt for the end user to say, maybe this shouldn't be trusted and you might want to check with your IT team. This vulnerability allows you to remove it, to effectively hide the mark of the web so that the what is called the alternate data stream, ADS, is able to hide the zone ID. So your PC doesn't know that it's come from the internet and potentially from an untrusted source. This is the weaponized vulnerability that is also public aware. This is the double whammy. Now, I am unsure why Microsoft would release this patch as a moderate severity, considering, to me, how severe this is. The fact that it's weaponized and public aware means that I do not understand why this is moderate. However, this is identified as your highest risk. It can be exploited over any network, including the internet, with low attack complexity, no privileges required by the user. Just any user with anything is able to launch this payload. But it does require the user to do it. So if your users are trained never to click something from the internet, great. If they haven't got the training or don't trust those users, please prioritize this update. This one doesn't have a jump point. My second selection today is CVE 2023-23397. This is a Microsoft Outlook spoofing vulnerability. Now, this is why it's interesting to me to see the combination of vendor severity and CVSS. An attacker could exploit the vulnerability by sending a specially crafted email, which triggers automatically when it's received by your email server. It hasn't even been opened on your computer yet. It could lead to exploitation even before you viewed it. Very serious. An attacker who successfully exploited the vulnerability could access a user's net NTLMv2 hash, which, by the way, is a challenge response. I had to figure this out as well. It's a challenge response used for authentication of a user. So your username, which is typically your domain name / username and your password, is actually hashed. It's actually a hash that is saved inside Windows, and each time you authenticate, you pass that hash through. It doesn't actually take your username, password, and verify it. It actually compares it to a hash that is used in the system and says, yes, you are allowed, or no, you are not allowed access to a resource. Now, an NTLM relay is effectively sending the hash to a process that then relays it to another process to authenticate as the user. So you might be able to start a service as a user that isn't you, because you've captured the hash, and that's a very serious issue. So if you could do this to a lot of users, you'll actually have access to a lot of potential admin accounts that you could use to exploit. This is also weaponized. The Microsoft has issued this as a vendor severity important, not critical, even though it has a CVSS of 9.1, and it's one of the highest CVSSs of this month. It doesn't have any public aware information at this time. There are no countermeasures. It can be exploited over any network, including the internet, with low attack complexity, no privileges, no user interaction, and luckily there is no jump point. And lastly, it was between one of two that they actually had the same SIX score. So I've gone with CVE 2023-23392. This is a HTTP protocol stack remote code execution vulnerability. Now, in most situations, an unauthenticated attacker could send a specially crafted packet to a targeted server. So this would be an IIS server, utilizing the HTTP protocol stack http.sys to process packets. This has been issued by the vendor as a critical severity, and CVSS is saying this is 9.8. There is a countermeasure. It isn't yet weaponized, and it can be attacked over any network with low attack complexity, no privileges, and no user interaction. If we scroll down, you'll see all of the CVEs that that have been released by Microsoft in the order in which they are ranked by the SIX score. So the top three here that we just mentioned are the ones at the top. The workaround for that last vulnerability that I mentioned is actually to enable HTTP 3. This is done by a registry key on the server. So if you set that on your server and reboot the device, this will actually act as a workaround before, in case you're not able to deploy this update. Microsoft is actually saying this particular vulnerability is more likely to be used. Just the next one down, this is the one that I was trying to pick which one. It had the same score. This one is CVE 2023-23415. This is an ICMP, remote code execution vulnerability. It is still more likely, just as others. However, if I was to pick from the two, I would choose this one. But if you can, please deploy them both. I really hope that this has been useful, and I hope that if you have any questions, please use the chat. Go onto our website, info@syxsense.com, send us any questions, and we'll get back to you privately. And of course, until next time, I wish you happy patching.